My name is Freya and I am 25 years old. The day before our wedding, my fiancé sent me a message that seemed simple, almost ordinary. I was sitting on the floor of my apartment, surrounded by wedding boxes, ribbons, and the soft white dress hanging carefully near the window. My phone buzzed, and when I looked down, his message appeared on the screen. My mom is inviting you to dinner today. At first I smiled. It felt like a sweet gesture. The night before the wedding, dinner with my future mother-in-law sounded like a warm tradition, a way of welcoming me into the family. But something about the message stayed in my mind longer than it should have. Maybe it was the suddenness of it, or maybe it was the quiet feeling in my chest that something about this evening was going to be important. Still, I replied yes, of course I would come. By evening, I drove to their house with the golden sunset stretching across the road. The neighborhood looked peaceful, almost too peaceful. His family home stood at the end of the street, with soft lights glowing through the windows. When I stepped out of the car, the smell of herbs and warm food drifted through the cool air. My fiancé opened the door with a big smile, kissed my cheek, and pulled me inside like nothing in the world could go wrong. His mother greeted me politely, the way she always did, friendly, but with a distance I could never quite explain. "Freya," she said gently, "I'm glad you came." The table was beautifully set, more elegant than I expected. Candles flickered softly, reflecting off the glasses and plates. For a moment, everything felt perfect, like a peaceful pause before the happiest day of my life. We sat down and dinner began. The conversation was light at first. My fiancé talked about tomorrow's wedding schedule, about the guests arriving in the morning, about the music and flowers. His mother listened quietly, occasionally smiling, occasionally studying me with a look I couldn't fully understand. I tried to relax, reminding myself that tomorrow I would officially become part of this family. But as the evening continued, something subtle began to feel strange. Small glances passed between my fiancé and his mother across the table. Not obvious ones, just quick looks, like silent messages being exchanged without words. Once or twice they leaned closer and whispered something I couldn't hear. I brushed the thought away. Families had their own habits, their own little ways of communicating. Still, the feeling lingered in the back of my mind like a quiet question waiting to be answered. By the time dessert arrived, the candles had burned lower and the room had grown warmer. We laughed about small things, about childhood stories, about the chaos weddings always bring. Then suddenly, near the end of the evening, something happened that made my heart pause. My future mother-in-law leaned toward my fiancé and spoke softly in a language I didn't expect to hear. It was smooth, flowing, and unmistakable Italian. I looked up quickly. My fiancé responded to her immediately, just as naturally, just as fluently. The two of them exchanged a few quick sentences in Italian, their voices quiet but relaxed, like it was something they had done many times before. Then they both laughed. Not loudly, but enough for the sound to echo strangely in the quiet dining room. My heart gave a small, confused thump. In the 2 years we had been together, my fiancé had never once mentioned speaking Italian, not once. I had even asked him before if he knew any other languages, and he had casually said no. Yet here he was, speaking it perfectly with his mother as if it were completely normal. I forced a polite smile and kept eating, pretending nothing had happened. But inside my thoughts were spinning. Why hide something like that? And why did they suddenly switch languages at the end of dinner? A few minutes later, the evening started wrapping up. His mother gathered the plates while my fiancé stepped outside to take a phone call. I stood up to help her carry dishes into the kitchen. The house felt quieter now, almost tense in a way I couldn't explain. She washed the dishes slowly while I dried them beside her. Neither of us spoke for a moment. The silence felt heavier than it should have. And then something happened that made the entire evening replay inside my mind. She looked at me, studying my face carefully, almost curiously. In that moment, the words from the dinner table echoed again in my thoughts. At the end of the evening, my future mother-in-law said something in Italian to my husband, and they both laughed. The sound of their laughter still lingered in my memory. I placed the last plate on the counter, turned toward her with a calm smile, and gently took my mother-in-law by the hand. Because before leaving that house, I needed to understand exactly what had been said. And deep inside, a strange feeling told me that whatever I was about to discover might change everything. About tomorrow's wedding, I was still holding her hand when the silence in the kitchen grew heavier. The warm light above the sink reflected in the clean dishes, and for a moment neither of us spoke. I looked at her calmly, but inside my heart was beating faster than I wanted to admit. That moment from the dinner table kept repeating in my mind. At the end of the evening, my future mother-in-law said something in Italian to my husband, and they both laughed. The laughter had sounded small, but it carried a strange weight. I finally broke the silence with a gentle smile. "I didn't know you both spoke Italian," I said quietly. She paused while drying a glass and looked at me. For a second, her expression didn't change, but then her eyes narrowed slightly with curiosity. "Did that surprise you?" she asked. I nodded lightly. "A little. In 2 years, he never mentioned it." She placed the glass down and folded the towel slowly, as if thinking carefully about her next words. "Well," she said softly, "some things don't come up in conversation." I nodded again, pretending to accept that answer. But the truth was, something deeper was bothering me. My fiancé had never been the kind of person to hide things. At least that's what I had always believed. Just then, the front door opened, and his footsteps echoed through the hallway as he walked back inside after finishing his call. He stepped into the kitchen with the same relaxed smile. "Everything okay in here?" he asked. His mother and I both looked at him. For a brief moment, the three of us stood there in an awkward triangle of silence. Then his mother said casually, "Freya was asking about the Italian we were speaking earlier." The smile on his face flickered for a fraction of a second. It was subtle, but I noticed it. "Oh," he said quickly, leaning against the counter. "Yeah, my mom and I used to speak it when I was younger." I crossed my arms lightly, still smiling. "That's interesting," I replied. "Because earlier you told me you didn't know any other languages." He hesitated. It was the first time all evening he looked slightly uncomfortable. "I guess I just never thought it was important," he said with a shrug. But something in his tone felt rehearsed. The kitchen grew quiet again. His mother glanced between us nervously, then suddenly said, "Well, it's getting late. Tomorrow is a big day." My fiancé nodded. "Yeah, we should probably get some rest." But before the moment could slip away, I spoke again. My voice was calm but firm. "What exactly did you say to each other in Italian at the table?" The question hung in the air like a suspended thread. My fiancé looked at his mother quickly. She looked back at him. That same silent communication I had noticed earlier passed between them again. Then he laughed lightly. "It was nothing," he said. "Just a small joke." I tilted my head slightly. "What joke?" He hesitated again, and that was when I decided to stop pretending. I took a slow breath and looked directly at both of them. Then, in clear and confident Italian, I said, "You asked him if I still didn't know about tomorrow, and he told you not to worry because I had no idea." The effect was instant. My fiancé froze. His mother's eyes widened in shock. The kitchen fell completely silent. "You understand Italian?" he asked slowly. I nodded. "Enough." His mother sat down heavily at the small table, clearly stunned. My fiancé rubbed the back of his neck, trying to gather his thoughts. "Okay," he said finally. "I guess the surprise is ruined." "What surprise?" I asked. He looked at me with an awkward smile. "Tomorrow after the wedding, we were going to tell you something big." My heart beat faster. "Tell me what?" He exhaled and spoke carefully. "We're moving to Italy." For a moment I didn't react. The words felt unreal. "Moving?" I repeated. "Yes," he said quickly. "I accepted a job there a few months ago. It's an incredible opportunity. My mom helped me arrange everything." My chest tightened. "You made this decision months ago?" He nodded. "I wanted to surprise you tomorrow after the ceremony. Imagine it. New country, new life, adventure together." I stared at him. "You planned my entire future without asking me." His smile faded slightly. "I thought you'd be happy." I looked at both of them standing in that kitchen, realizing something important in that moment. It wasn't the move itself that hurt. It was the fact that they had decided everything for me, and laughed about how I didn't know. I picked up my purse calmly. "Freya, wait," he said quickly. But I walked toward the door and turned back one last time. "Thank you for dinner," I said quietly. "But tomorrow, there won't be a wedding." His face went pale. "What?" I met his eyes steadily. "Because the person I marry will be someone who makes decisions with me. Not for me." The house was silent as I stepped outside into the cool night air. The stars above the street were bright and clear, and for the first time that evening I felt something unexpected. Peace. Sometimes the bravest thing you can do is walk away from the life someone else planned for you, and choose your own. My name is Talia, and I'm 26 years old. I still remember the moment everything in my family quietly fell apart, just days before Thanksgiving. It started with a phone call from my mom that sounded strangely cold. The kind of voice people use when they've already made a decision about you. I was standing in my apartment kitchen, staring at the grocery list I had been making for the trip home, when she said something that made my heart drop. My mom said, "You won't be at Thanksgiving this year. Your sister's new husband thinks you'd ruin the vibe." For a few seconds I thought I had misheard her. Ruin the vibe? I asked her what she meant, but she just sighed like she was tired of the conversation before it even started. She told me that my sister's new husband, Ethan, felt uncomfortable around me, and that since this was his first Thanksgiving with the family, they didn't want drama. Drama? I barely even knew the guy. I had met him exactly twice, once at their rushed wedding dinner, and once at a short family brunch where he barely spoke to me. Still, somehow I had already become the problem. I stood there gripping my phone, while my mom kept explaining things as if it were perfectly reasonable to uninvite your own daughter from a holiday. She said it would only be this year, and that maybe next year things would feel different. But what hurt the most wasn't even the excuse, it was how easily everyone seemed to agree with it. My sister hadn't called me. My dad hadn't called me. It was like they had all quietly decided I didn't belong at the table anymore. I felt that heavy, familiar feeling I'd had growing up. The one where I somehow ended up being the odd one out in my own family. I wanted to argue, to defend myself, to ask what exactly Ethan had said about me. But the truth was, I already knew how those conversations went. If I pushed, they'd say I was proving his point. So instead, I did the one thing no one expected. I said nothing. I just told my mom I understood and ended the call. That night, I sat alone in my apartment with the silence pressing in around me. Outside, the city was already glowing with early holiday lights, but inside my chest it felt dark and hollow. I kept replaying those words in my mind. You won't be at Thanksgiving this year. It sounded less like a request and more like a verdict. Eventually, anger replaced the sadness. Who was Ethan to decide whether I belonged in my own family? And more importantly, why were they letting him? I tried to remember our short interactions. At the wedding dinner, he had watched me strangely when I mentioned where I worked, like the information had caught him off guard. At brunch, he had asked me a few careful questions about my job, my office, my position. Questions that felt less like curiosity, and more like he was trying to confirm something. At the time, I brushed it off as awkward small talk. Now, lying awake in the dark, I wondered if there had been something else in his expression. Something like recognition or fear, but the more I thought about it, the less sense it made. I hadn't done anything to this man. I didn't even know him well enough to offend him. By midnight, I had convinced myself to stop caring. If my family didn't want me there, fine. I'd make my own plans for Thanksgiving. I'd cook something simple, maybe watch movies, maybe even take a short trip somewhere quiet. I told myself I was okay with it, but deep down the rejection still stung like a fresh bruise. The next morning, I went to work determined to push the whole thing out of my mind. My office building downtown was already buzzing when I walked in. The usual morning rush of employees, ringing phones, and the smell of coffee drifting through the halls. Work had always been the one place where things felt steady and predictable. I liked that. I liked being someone people relied on instead of someone they excluded. I had just settled at my desk and opened my laptop when my assistant knocked lightly on the door. She looked a little confused. "Talia," she said carefully, "there's a man in reception asking for you. He says it's urgent." I frowned. I wasn't expecting any meetings that morning. "Did he give a name?" I asked. She nodded slowly. "Ethan?" My stomach tightened instantly. What was my sister's husband doing here? For a moment, I wondered if something had happened to my sister or my parents. But my assistant didn't look worried, just puzzled. I stood up, smoothed my jacket, and walked out toward reception, my thoughts racing with questions. When I turned the corner and saw him standing there, he looked nothing like the calm, polite guy I had met at the wedding. He looked tense, almost panicked. The second his eyes landed on me, his face went pale like he had just seen a ghost. For a split second, neither of us moved. Then suddenly everything exploded at once. His chair scraped loudly against the floor as he shot to his feet, staring at me with wide, terrified eyes. And right there in the middle of my office reception area, with employees turning to watch in confusion, he started screaming because the moment Ethan saw me standing in the reception area of my office, his entire body froze like he had just walked into a nightmare he never expected to see. For a second, the whole room went silent except for the faint humming of computers and the distant ringing of phones. Then suddenly his chair screeched backward as he jumped to his feet, staring at me with wide, panicked eyes. And right there, in front of my staff and half the people waiting in the lobby. He started screaming because he had just realized exactly who I was. No, this can't be right, he muttered first, shaking his head as if he were trying to wake himself up from a bad dream. But when I stepped a little closer, confused and trying to understand what was happening, his panic only grew worse. You work here? He blurted out, his voice cracking. I frowned. Yes, I do. Why are you here? The receptionist, my assistant, and several employees were staring between us, clearly sensing something strange unfolding. Ethan looked around the office lobby again, noticing the company logo on the wall, the security badges, the staff quietly watching us. His breathing grew faster, and suddenly his voice dropped into a whisper that sounded almost horrified. You're Talia. Talia Morgan? The compliance director. I blinked. Yes. The moment I confirmed it, his face completely drained of color. His hands began shaking so badly he had to grab the back of the chair beside him. And then he said the one sentence that made the entire situation make sense. Oh my God. Your sister didn't know. At that point, I wasn't confused anymore. I was irritated. Know what? I asked firmly. Ethan swallowed hard. She didn't know you were the person investigating my company. The air in the room suddenly felt heavy. For a second even, I just stared at him, processing the words. Because yes, it was true. I was leading an internal regulatory investigation into a mid-sized financial consulting firm suspected of fraudulent reporting. It was a complicated case that had been quietly developing for months, but I had never once heard Ethan mention where he worked in detail. At the wedding dinner, he had simply said he worked in financial consulting. I hadn't thought much of it at the time. Now everything clicked into place all at once. The strange looks he had given me, the careful questions about my job, the tension every time our paths crossed. Ethan ran both hands through his hair in complete panic. When I saw your name at the wedding guest list, I thought it was just a coincidence, he said quickly, his words tumbling over each other. But then I saw you again at brunch and I started worrying. I asked your sister what you did and she said, you worked in corporate compliance, but she didn't know details. I thought if you came around the family too much, you might figure out where I worked. I crossed my arms slowly, letting him keep talking. So you told my family I'd ruin the vibe at Thanksgiving? I asked. He looked ashamed but nodded. I just needed distance. If you started asking questions, if you connected the company name, I could lose everything. The irony of the situation was almost unbelievable. My own family had cut me off from Thanksgiving because my sister's new husband was afraid I might accidentally discover something illegal he was involved in. But what Ethan didn't realize yet was the part that truly terrified him. I looked him straight in the eyes and said calmly, Ethan, the investigation already connected the dots last week. His face completely collapsed. What? Your company name came up in a financial audit. We've already pulled the records. He looked like the ground had disappeared beneath his feet. His voice dropped into a desperate whisper. You're going to report it. I didn't answer immediately. I simply studied him, the man who had convinced my own family to exclude me just to protect himself. The man who thought pushing me away would stop the truth from catching up with him. Finally, I spoke. That depends on what the records show, I said evenly. But I suggest you start preparing for some very serious questions. At that moment, Ethan looked less like a confident new husband, and more like a man realizing the consequences of his choices were already closing in. He had come to my office that morning hoping to confirm whether I was the same Talia he feared. Instead, he had walked straight into the worst possible confirmation. After a long silence, he nodded weakly, muttered a quiet apology, and walked out of the lobby looking like someone heading toward a storm he couldn't escape. The moment the doors closed behind him, my assistant turned to me slowly with wide eyes. Do I even want to know what that was about? She asked. I exhaled and shook my head with a faint smile. Not today. But later that evening, sitting alone again in my apartment, I thought about the strange twist of fate. My family believed I was the one who would ruin Thanksgiving. But the truth was, the only reason Ethan was afraid of me was because he already knew what he had done. And sometimes the truth has a way of showing up exactly where people least expect it.